Okay, welcome everybody. Nice to see so many people. Nice at the end of term. Before we start, I'd just like to go through a few things about toilets. Toilets for men are in the corridor, right? And when you get to the end of term night, the men's toilets will be on the left. Toilets for women, keep walking past the lobby where the stairs are coming down, and then somebody left. Not expecting a fire alarm. If we do have one, we go out this door, and then there's a door to the right to go outside. We're live streaming this lecture and we're filming it so that we can use it later and put it on the website. So the live streaming is happening from this laptop here. We want people who are watching at home to be able to hear clearly, so try to keep down background noise because it will mean that their experience is better online. I know you're not normally around the audience. Also, would it be okay, Svenny has reminded me to ask you, would it be alright if we filmed the audience a little bit tonight? We've applied for some money within Heriot-Watt University, one of the 3 universities involved in EdSigns, and they're making a little video clip to illustrate how we work. So if anyone doesn't really want to be on that shot of all of us here tonight, just let me know, and we won't include you. I think we'll do that maybe after Mariela's talk, just before we have questions or something like that. Just so that we get an idea. And yes, Svenny would also like to take some photos. So again, put your hand up if you don't really want to be in the photos.
Just try.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks very much for coming. Thank you very much to the interpreters and the filmers, the live streamers. I'd like to welcome Dr. Mariela Fordyce, who works here at the University of Edinburgh as a researcher and School of Education. And she's going to be reporting on some research which is about the transitions of deaf people from school to college to university to work. Thank you very much, Mariela.
Hello, can you hear me okay? I'm very happy to be here tonight. I'll be talking about this study, which was about 18 months long. We started working on it in June 2012, and we finished it last year in October. It was carried out by a team of researchers at the University of Edinburgh, myself and Professor Sheila Riddell, who is the head of the Centre for Research in Education, Inclusion and Diversity here at the university, Rachel O'Neill, who doesn't need any introductions, and Elizabeth Whedon, who is the senior researcher at the Centre. We also owe special thanks to Audrey Cameron. She's the deaf researcher who helped us with the ESL interviews, which are part of this study. I'll move on to the first slide. So as I was saying, this was a 18-month study. It was commissioned by the National Deaf Children's Society in 2012. And its main aim was to investigate the possible transition process of young people who are deaf and hard of hearing in Scotland. Now, the main focus of the study was the point where people need compulsory education and move to their immediate destinations, which would be further education, higher education, training, or employment. But what we did, we enlarged the focus of the study a little bit. So we also looked at transitions from college to employment, for instance, or from university to employment. We realized that we couldn't understand transitions very well if we only looked at the transition point. And we, in our interviews, which I'll talk about soon, we also focused on their school experiences. We also looked at what happened after they left school, at the support and barriers they encountered in, for instance, further education or higher education. We also looked at the impact of all these factors on their ability to achieve independent adulthood. Right, I'm moving now to the second slide, the context of the research. This study was born from recognition of the fact that young people with disabilities, and deaf young people as well, have difficulties entering the labor market. And research has proven so far that one of the reasons for this comes from the fact that they are less likely to engage in post-16 education and training. Now, we know that the Scottish Government has taken steps to improve the support for school leavers with additional support needs in Scotland. For instance, the Code of Practice, which is associated with the Additional Support for Learning Act, sets specific duties on schools to ensure that the educational transitions of young people who have additional support needs are as smooth as possible. The Code of Practice also recommends that transition planning starts at least 12 months before the expected school leaving date. There are also guidelines for all the other institutions involved in supporting young people with additional support needs after they leave school. For instance, the post-16 transitions practice and policy framework. However, there has been a lot of research that has proven that there are gaps in the way these policies are being implemented. And a lot more needs to be done to improve transition practices for this group. At the same time, the uncertainties that surround deaf young people's transitions from school to work seem to be aggravated by the fact that at the moment the UK government is reforming the welfare system. And this reform consists of a complete overhaul of the benefits and welfare system. You may have heard, for instance, that the disability allowance has been replaced by personal independence payments, and that other forms of support, like the job seekers allowance, has been replaced by universal credit. However, equality legislation and recent developments in equality legislation have recently sought to strengthen the position of people with disabilities on the labour market. And for instance, the General Equality Duty, which is associated with the Equality Act 2010, it aims to protect disabled job seekers by placing duties on employers not to discriminate in the way they offer employment. And we'll see that we found some interesting things about this later on in the study. Moving now to the third slide, methods. Right, we set out to evaluate the post-school transitions of people who are deaf and hard of hearing by collecting data from 3 different sources. We first of all carried an analysis of policy and legislation. We looked at transition policies, for instance, policies related to employment and training. And then we also carried an analysis, secondary analysis of administrative and survey data. And this is data from various sources, including the Scottish Government, the Higher Education Statistics Agency, the Department for Work and Pensions, Labour Force Survey, the Association of Graduate Advisory Services, and Career Development Scotland. Skills Development Scotland. This is data that helped us put together a picture of, for instance, the proportion of people who are deaf and hard of hearing in Scottish schools, actually only publicly funded Scottish schools. We also looked at participation rates in higher and further education and employment rates. And the third strand of data that we drew on were interviews with 30 young people aged 18 to 24. This was probably the largest part of our study. Now, the young people who took part in this study were people who were educated or lived in Scotland. Their degrees of hearing loss varied from mild to profound, although most of them were in the severe to profound range. 5 of them communicated mainly in ESL, and the rest preferred to communicate orally. And although some of the participants in this study have mild hearing loss, I will be referring to them as deaf young people, just for reasons of brevity to keep things simple. Right, I will tell you a bit more about the people who took part in the study. We wanted to make sure that the sample of 30 people reflected the characteristics of the wider population of people in this age group. So when we selected people, we tried to collect information about their ethnic background, about their socioeconomic status, urban or rural residence, highest qualifications, and presence other disabilities or additional support needs. We did this in recognition of the fact that individual experiences are shaped by complex interactions between various factors. And I think we're right to do this because we found out later on that one of these factors, the socioeconomic status, seem to influence post-school outcomes to a very large degree. And I will talk about that later. Right. I will tell you a bit now about the content of the interviews. The interviews did not focus only on the transition point. We also asked questions about their school background. We wanted to understand what happened after they left school as well. We looked at their experience of post-16 education, training, and employment. And we also wanted to understand issues related to identity and social networks. I will move now to the fourth slide, which is an overview of the findings. Well, we had quite a lot of findings in the end. We had a mix of life history interviews and official statistics, and this helped us paint a pretty comprehensive picture of young people's journeys through the education system and beyond into the labour market. In this presentation, I will present the findings by sector. I will start with school experiences. I will focus then on post-school transition planning, and then I will talk about experiences of higher education, further education and training, employment, and looking for work as well. And I will also be talking about markers of adulthood. Whenever I present findings, I will be combining the main findings from the review of the statistics with the findings from the interviews. I'm moving now to the fifth slide, interpreting the data. I thought it would be very useful to include this slide here because when we were writing up the report, the NDCS team asked us what sort of claims they can make based on the findings of the study. So I would like to explain that what we did was basically mixed methods research, which combined qualitative research with quantitative research. We looked at official statistics, or if you'd like to, administrative data and survey data, and this helped us understand broad patterns in the population. And then through the interviews, we were able to understand individual experiences. We were able to explain whether individual experiences were typical or atypical within the population, and this provided us with quite a good understanding of what young people experience at the transition point. Right, and there is another issue that I should discuss with you, which is the representativeness of the sample. When we set out to do the study, we were hoping to put together a sample, a group of people which are representative of the wider population of young people who are deaf and hard of hearing. However, what we found was that the young people who volunteered to take part in the study tended to be university educated and tended to come from very from socially advantaged backgrounds, which means that the study, the sample was basically not representative. Half of the people who we interviewed had a university degree or were going to have a university degree in the near future. In the wider population, they are only about a quarter of young people have a university degree. So in order to counteract for this, in order to make up for this sort of limitation of the study, what I did, I tried to make the people with lower qualifications and came from poorer backgrounds as visible as possible in the report. I'm moving now to the sixth slide, school experiences. Most participants went to mainstream schools and were educated orally. 25 out of the 30 we interviewed. Some went to mainstream schools with resource bases for the deaf, and the minority went to special schools for the deaf. What we found was that we don't know at the moment the total number of pupils who are deaf and hard of hearing in Scottish schools. We can only make estimates at this point. Those who went to schools for the deaf, or BSL users, and what we found was that unlike the rest of the deaf young people in the study, BSL users seem to have more difficulties in finding provision or finding schools which fit their academic and social expectations. So they tend to change schools quite a lot. And 3 BSL users from socially advantaged areas in Scotland went to England for their secondary education, which is quite interesting. Most of those who were educated in mainstream schools received academic support from teachers of the deaf. Some received support from educational audiologists, from learning support departments, or communication support workers. And a thing that we found was that there was quite a lot of variation in support between schools and local authorities. Some authorities, for instance, apart from academic support, also provided peer groups, which gave people the opportunity to interact with other young people who were deaf. But on the other hand, we also found a few young people in our study who reported that they had no support at various stages of their education. Another interesting finding was that about a third of the participants in to the studies seem to believe that they encountered communication barriers in spite of the support they received. They thought that they couldn't take part in class, they couldn't take part in class as much as they wanted to, and they couldn't engage in extracurricular activities. They believed that those barriers were a direct consequence of the fact that of their hearing loss. Because they couldn't hear teachers in class or they couldn't listen to audio materials. There were some complaints as well of teachers' lack of deaf awareness, and there were lots of frequent mentions of lack of subtitles, for instance, on audio materials. However, the most commonly cited difficulties were not necessarily academic but social, and it was quite interesting to see that 2/3 of the participants in the study mentioned that they were bullied or at least felt socially isolated in schools, and they believe that this was a direct consequence of the fact they were deaf. In some extreme cases, the bullying had negative consequences on their academic performance and on their well-being, personal well-being. It was interesting as well to notice that those who did not mention being bullied tended to either have deaf family or friends, or to perform very well academically. Right. Another interesting finding was the fact that many of the people who received learning support in schools believed that that support made them stand out, and some of them didn't want to stand out among their peers. And this was the reason why they stopped using radio aids, for instance, or they even turned out any kind of academic support in secondary school. Moving on to the 7th slide, school leavers attainment. This is a graph which shows a comparison of the qualifications of school leavers from public funded schools in Scotland in 2012. In blue, we have the qualifications of those who don't have any disabilities, and in red, we have the qualifications of school leavers who are deaf. This is not the entire range of qualifications. Just trying to keep it as simple as possible. I'm only focused on the top and on the lower and higher end of the qualification spectrum. And you will notice on the left that many more deaf young people left school with no qualifications or very low qualifications, while on the right you will see that people with no disabilities were almost twice as likely to go to university. The last two columns show the number of people who left school with hires and advanced hires. And you will see that the difference is quite marked at this stage. So this was also reflected in their post-school destinations, and I'm moving on to slide 8. This graph shows a comparison again between school leavers who are deaf and school leavers with no disabilities. And These are their destinations. This is what they were doing 9 months after they left school in 2012. While most school leavers with no support needs or disabilities went into higher education, you see that on the left, about just under 40% went into higher education. The majority of school leavers who are deaf went into further education. We also see that people who are deaf and hard of hearing were underrepresented on training programs and in employment, and they were more likely to be looking for work or to be unemployed and not seeking work at the time, 9 months after they left school. I'm moving on to slide 9, post-school transition planning. Right, these are the findings on what happened when they left school, which was the main focus of our study. And interestingly, most participants did not have any post-school transition plans, although the code of practice recommends that planning starts 12 months before the expected school leaving date. Those who aimed, there were some differences. Those who aimed to go to university were better informed about school leavers than those who had lower qualifications. Now, it's up to you to figure out why. It's very possible that those who go to university have more information available about universities than those who go into further education or training. Or another explanation is that those who go to university have parents who have gone to university themselves, and they have more resources and they're more able to support them at that point. I'm going to go back a bit to the post-school transition plans. As I was saying, most participants did not have any post-school transition plans. Actually, only 4 out of 30 had some sort of planning. And what we found is that out of those 4, 3 had learning difficulties and 1 was in a school with a resource base. So this meant that there was a huge variation between schools in the way they interpreted the code of practice. Basically, young people who had learning difficulties seemed to benefit from the guidance in the code of practice. Young people who had other types of difficulties, such as social, emotional and behavior disorders or dyslexia, did not have transition plans. Right, so this concludes the findings regarding the post-school transition planning. I would like to talk, before I move on, about difficulties in transition to adult social and health services. There were some complaints amongst the people in our study about the kind of support they had when they moved from adult health services or social services from child services to adult services. And we had one example, for instance, of a mother of a young man with complex needs who reported that when her son turned 18, child services were suddenly withdrawn, and he had no adult services to replace them. I'm moving now to slide 10, experiences of higher education. What we found was that in universities and colleges of higher education, there was quite a good level of support, and most of the people we interviewed were recipients of disabled students' allowance, which paid for equipment and communication support. There was some variation between institutions. For instance, some institutions provided disabled students' allowance provided support before disabled students' allowance arrived, because it takes a while. There's always a gap or a lag of a few months before the actual money or the grant comes in. Some universities would leave students without any support, while some universities would provide that support during that time as well. The disabled students' allowance paid for communication support such as note takers, which was the most common form of support. Some people also had BSL interpreters, readers, scribes, and proofreaders. And also equipment was quite frequently mentioned, laptops and printers. Now, note-taking was considered a very valuable form of support. However, some people acknowledged the fact that it had limitations, and these limitations consisted of things like note-takers' availability, for especially at short notice. The high turnover rates among note-takers. In some cases, note-takers lack of subject knowledge. Although support in higher education was quite good, people still complained of the fact that they encountered communication barriers, and this happened particularly when they had to take part in group work at university or when they had to go on clinical or teacher training. Another thing that we found when we thought it was quite interesting was the fact that applying and receiving DSA did not seem to be a guarantee for ensuring support. We found that there was also a need for good self-advocacy skills. Pastoral support from disability advisors was very well appreciated, and in some cases, parental involvement in negotiating support was essential. We had examples of people whose support was withdrawn for various reasons, and parents would intervene and have their support reinstated. Another interesting finding was that the students from disadvantaged backgrounds, sorry, I'm going to refer to this throughout my presentation, the students from disadvantaged backgrounds were more likely to drop out of university. Reasons for this may be, there may be various reasons for this, but one of them may be lack of parental support, probably lack of self-advocacy skills. Sorry, this is it. I'm moving on to slide 11. Further education and training. What we found was that in further education, the support was pretty patchy. There was a lot of variation, wide variation between the quality of support offered by institutions across Scotland. There was also variation in the consistency of the support. Many people mentioned that communication support workers were in short supply and they were often unavailable. There was very little mention of specialized equipment in further education. And generally speaking, further education students were less appreciative of the disability support offices, services offered by colleges, and they were more positive about the informal support offered by their peers and the teaching staff. And there was very poor support on training programs. By training programs, I mean programs like modern apprenticeships or training for work or getting ready for work. There was actually no communication support as far as we know. There were very few people who were BSL users on training programs, and this may be one of the direct consequences of the lack of support. There were fewer instances of self-advocacy and parental involvement amongst people who went to further education and training. Now, why is this? One of the reasons for this might be the fact that these young people tended to be from poor backgrounds, and therefore their parents didn't have the social resources to offer them support in colleges and training programs. Right, I will move on to slide 12, employment rates of working age people in the UK by disability status. Now, this slide shows that in the UK, and these are not just young people, and these are all working age people in the UK. In the UK, people who have difficulties in hearing have much lower employment rates than people with disabilities. People with difficulties in hearing have employment rates just below 50%, while those who have no disabilities are have employment rates closer to 80%. The difference is quite marked at this. I'm going to move on again to slide 13, destinations of graduates. Now, the destination, this is data from the from ACAS, the Association of Graduate Careers Advisory Services, and it's based on a survey to higher education graduates. It shows basically what university graduates are doing 9 months after they completed their degrees. I'm going to focus only on the blue and red lines. The blue line represents people, the percentage of people in full-time employment, while the red line represents the people in first row you have people with no disabilities, and on the bottom you have people who are deaf or have any kind of hearing loss. What we found was that the employment rate, the full-time employment rates of these two groups are not very different for graduates, which means that the people who are deaf and hard of hearing and people who have degrees have very good post-university outcomes. They have high employment rates, and they get employed in occupations which are at a degree level. This stands in stark contrast with the previous slide I showed you about the general employment rates of the working age population in Scotland, in the UK. And what this suggests is that it's not the people who are graduates, but it's the people with lower qualifications who really struggle on the labour market. And this was reflected in our findings from the interviews. I'm moving now to slide 14. Barriers to finding and staying in employment. This is data from our interviews, and I will present this as a comparison between people who have degrees and people who have lower qualifications, and for brevet, which is called them graduates and non-graduates. And what we found was that all the young people that we interviewed encountered several barriers on the labour market. Some were common to both groups, but some were specific to people with lower qualifications. For instance, many of them talked about lack of accessibility in applying for work. There were complaints about the fact they had to have telephone interviews, for instance, the fact that they had to take part in group exercises or group interviews, and they felt that they were disadvantaged in these kind of situations. The fact that they could not take advantage of networking opportunities or work or career fairs. Also, discrimination was one of the topics that came up quite a lot from the interviews. All of the people that we talked to feared discrimination when they were applying for work. However, what we found was that young people who had graduate degrees were less likely to encounter instances of open discrimination from employers. On the contrary, they often benefited from the fact that they were disability schemes in which people with disability were guaranteed an interview when they applied for work. And they would often take advantage of this. People who had lower qualifications tended to encounter potential employers who had open negative views about their ability to do their jobs. And I will talk about a bit more a bit later. Lack of deaf awareness was also one of the things that applied to both people with graduate degrees and people with lower qualifications. However, people with lower qualifications also had limited work experience, and this impacted on their ability to find work. They also had limited social networks, and you might be wondering why we're talking about social networks at this point. Well, what we found was that people who had university degrees tended to find work through their parents quite a lot, with friends. So their social networks were quite important in helping them enter the labour market. There were quite a few instances of young people who found jobs in the same fields as their parents, or with the direct help of their parents, or their close family or friends. Now, people with lower qualifications did not seem to have friends or family who had the resources to help them enter the labour market, not to the same degree. So the social networks or the social resources they had seemed to be a very important factor in helping them find employment. Lack of supporting employment was another interesting issue because people with graduate degrees seem to be very much aware of support schemes like access to work. BSL users knew about this as well, but people, in particular people with lower qualifications and who did not use BSL, so they were hard of hearing, did not know of support options or like access to work at the time of the interview. Although it was clear from the interviews that they needed support in their jobs. I'm moving now to the 15th slide, markers of adulthood. What we found that there were also marked differences between people who had university degrees and people with low qualifications in their ability to reach what we call markers of adulthood. And by this, I mean independent living arrangements. For instance, people who went to university went to university away from home, so they have this experience of living away from their parents, while people who went to colleges or on training programs tended to live with their parents, to stay with their parents. Those who went to university tended to be geographically mobile, not only during the university years, but also afterwards. They achieved financial independence sooner. They have wider social networks, we talked about this already, and they also have very clear career plans about their future. I'm moving now to the 16th slide, socioeconomic status and post-school outcomes. This was probably one of the most interesting, one of the most salient findings of the study was the fact that there is a strong association between parental socioeconomic status and post-school outcomes. And this was reflected in several domains. For instance, parental support and advocacy powers. We talked about this especially at university and in schools. People who came from socially advantaged backgrounds tended to have parents who had very high expectations of the kind of support that their children receive in schools, and they also use their advocacy power to get the best support possible for their children. Also, school qualifications was one of the domains in which these two groups differed a lot. What we found was that people from socially advantaged backgrounds tended to have higher qualifications on the whole. And this is true not only for people who are deaf and hard of hearing, this is true for the entire population on the whole. But what we found was that in case of people who are deaf and hard of hearing, this difference in qualification was magnified by the fact that at the moment they left school, some entered further education where the support was not as good, and some entered higher education where the support was very good and then employment outcomes were very good afterwards. Post-school destinations, we just talked about this. There were marked differences between their post-school destinations as well. The amount of work experience they had was different. Young people who went to university started to work with their current employers, in many cases during their university years. So they had extensive work experience before they entered the labor market, before they entered full-time employment. This was not necessarily the case for those who were in further education or training. Well, training is different, but in further education it did not apply. We also talked about the degree of discrimination they encountered on the labor market. Again, there were differences between people with higher qualifications who were from more advantaged backgrounds and those who had lower qualifications. And finally, the employment rates were different. People from more advantaged backgrounds had higher employment rates. Right, and I'm moving now to slide 17, which contains my conclusions. Young people who are deaf and hard of hearing have poor school and post-school outcomes than their hearing peers. School qualifications and post-school outcomes were strongly associated with parental socioeconomic status. Those with higher education qualifications had good employment outcomes, and the most disadvantaged group were the young people who came from low socioeconomic groups and left school with few or no qualifications. And I will talk a little bit about the limitations of the study. Although we talked a lot in the study about the importance of the socioeconomic background, we actually had a relatively low number of people who came from poor backgrounds in the study. So I believe that if our sample was representative of the wider population, this finding would have been even more stronger. And another limitation of the study was the fact that it did not include the views of practitioners. It consisted simply on a review of statistics and interviews with young people. my presentation. If you'd like more information about the study, all the outputs are uploaded at the link above. So this is it. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to having some questions.
Thank you very much, Mariela. We do have a couple of time for questions and comments and suggestions, etc. I do have a question myself, maybe to just kick you off. I was just wondering, I mean, this was really, really interesting, thank you. And I was just wondering if you've got any plans of what to do with this information now. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
The study was funded by the National Deaf Children's Society, and so far the National Deaf Children's Society have used the finding of the study to define their future policy lines, basically, and they have launched a campaign which is called Close the Gap, which aims basically to help young people who are deaf and hard of hearing in Scotland achieve as well as their hearing peers. The campaign was launched, I think, in April, the end of April, by the Scottish Government. It was very well received, and I think it was endorsed by several political figures in Scotland. We are also looking forward. Sorry to continue. We are also looking forward to doing further research on this topic. We are looking forward at doing more research, not only with people who are deaf and hard of hearing, but people who have other disabilities, because we do believe that these findings will apply to a certain degree to people who have other types of disabilities, like visual impairment, for instance, or learning disabilities, learning difficulties.
Should I come to the front?
Yes, please.
I actually have two questions. I think they're both linked, but I do have two questions. So you talked about the backgrounds of the participants. I'm interested in how you recruited them, and also whether they were self-selected and how reluctant or willing they were to participate in the project. If you could give me a bit more information about that.
The people who we interviewed were self-selected. What we did, first of all, we used a database that we have here at the university that Rachel Lee is in charge of, which is the Deaf Achievement Scotland study. Some of the people who took part in that study have agreed to take part in further research. So we contacted those people first of all, and obviously we interviewed everyone who volunteered to take part in the study. When we were doing this, we found out, we basically came to our dilemma, which was that most of the people who volunteered to take part in the study were people who had university degrees or were students at the time. So at that point, we realized that we had to make efforts to reach out to groups, to other groups of young people, and we appealed for help, basically, from the National Deaf Children's Society. We used their emailing database to email parents who are members of the National Deaf Children's Society and encourage their children to contact us. So his participation was voluntary, 100%, and we did interview everyone who volunteered to take part in the study. It was great. We are very grateful to those who took part in the study. There was no reluctance, as far as I can see, apart from people who just didn't want to. Didn't want to take part in the study at all and didn't contact us. But those who did take part in the study were very much willing to make a difference. They were very much aware of the fact that their experiences in school and in what happened after they left school would help future generations of children and young people who are deaf and hard of hearing. And they were really, they tried as much as they could to help us to collect lots of data, and I'm very pleased with the kind of data we're taking. They're very helpful.
You said you had a second question? Okay.
Yeah, if they were being asked.
Do you want to come to the front?
Yeah, the mic's at the front. Just stand there, Mariela.
I remember what my question was. On a couple of slides, I counted slide 14 and slide 16, you made reference to discrimination. You've done 16, you talk about discrimination in recruitment practices and discrimination in the labour market. Now, as I understand the way you describe the methodology, the evidence for that discrimination comes from interviews with young people. So if these are young people who've gone for a job, not got the job, and then tell you, I was discriminated against, are there some further questions that could be asked about that?
Sure. When we talk to young people, we talk to, most of the people that we talk to have some sort of employment experience. If their employment experiences started when they were in high school, in many cases, they could have been temporary work, have been summer jobs. So they have various forms of employment. I'm not talking here only about full-time employment, although that was the point where I guess formal interviews took place and they were more likely to be discriminated against. But no, I have to say that I kept in touch with some of the people I interviewed, and even those who said that they thought they had been discriminated against would contact me later on to say they did get a job or not. So basically, I don't think this was just a reaction to I did not get the job and this is the reason why I didn't get it. It was simply the fact that this was based on various, several experiences over time. For instance, we had two young women who had very low qualifications who said that they noticed when they applied for jobs that when they mentioned their deafness or in some cases complex needs on the application form, they did not get called for the interview. When they tried to apply to for the same company without any mention of their disability, they did get called for interview. So this, to me, it's a pretty clear clear proof of discrimination. Another case study that comes to mind right now is that of a young woman who uses BSL. She, when she applied for the job, she did not mention she was deaf in the application form, but she had, being a BSL user, she had to contact the employer, potential employer, and tell them that she needed an interpreter at the job interview, and then the interview got cancelled. So again, I would say this is a pretty clear case of discrimination. There are also narratives, basically descriptions of interview of the situations in interviews. Another woman who was a beautician, I remember, she was oral. She communicated orally. She had pretty good speech, I would say, and she told me that on a couple of occasions she was interviewed by people who openly questioned her ability to work with the public, in spite of the fact that she had been employed in that sort of job before. So I would say that discrimination was something that was pretty common for certain types of people. But even when discrimination was not open, even when there wasn't an open evidence of discrimination, you would have young people who would say, I didn't do very well in the interview, and I always wonder, I know that they try very hard not to make deafness an issue, but I always wonder whether deafness is on their mind when they interview. So the fear of discrimination was there in those cases as well. Of course, we deal with perceptions of discrimination. If we interview employers, that would be very interesting to interview them and see what sort of experiences or attitudes they have. That would be very interesting to do as well.
Are there any plans to do this, to interview employers? Sorry. Are there any plans?
Not at the moment, but yes, if we do continue doing research on this topic, definitely employers' points of view and also parents' points of view, I would say, would bring a lot of riches to the data.
I'm not sure whether I can phrase this properly, but let me have a go. You made reference early on to some deaf young people refusing support and not wanting to stand out.
Yes.
And I'm just interested from this research or from outside of this, whether you have any comments on the impact of lack of early self-confidence and positive self-esteem on the part of deaf children.
Thank you. It's a very good question. I don't know anything about the early years. I have to say I can't say anything that I did not cover in the study, because I don't want to base this on my own perceptions. But what we did find, speaking of self-confidence and self-esteem, was that it did seem to make a huge difference in the way these people integrated socially at school. And this reluctance to stand out that I talked about, sorry, I will just go to that slide that we had. This was I'm on slide 6, school experiences. In secondary schools, it was quite common amongst teenagers to refuse support. It depended a lot on whether they were the only deaf child in the school. That was a very important factor. It depended a lot on whether they had parents or friends who were deaf. And also it depended on the kind of school they were in. If the school had a resource center, they were less likely to, obviously, to turn down support, because they were not the only ones receiving that kind of support. But if they were young people from a hearing family and who were the only child who was deaf in the school, and also had very little contact outside school with young people who were deaf, they were more likely to have negative attitudes about deafness in general, and they were more likely to turn down support. We had some very sad, I would say, testimonies from young people who would say that the fact that I'm deaf makes me feel bad every day, basically, that I feel embarrassed at the fact that I'm deaf. And so we had this kind of attitudes, but on the other hand, we had people who were very proud of them. So there was a huge variation within the group of the young people that we interviewed, within variation in the way they viewed their own deafness. And this affected their confidence and the way they behaved, basically, socially.
So with the interviews, I know that you said some are sign language users and some are oral. How did you conduct the interviews? I mean, I know that you're part of the research team, so could you just explain a bit more about the interviews itself?
We had people. First of all, we asked all the young people were contacted by email, and we asked them whether they wanted to have the interview conducted orally or in British Sign Language or Sign SSC. And what we found was, we found that a few people wanted to prefer British Sign Language, and they were interviewed by a deaf researcher who is proficient in ESL. The interviews conducted in British Sign Language were taped, they were videotaped, and then they were translated into English. They were conducted, we basically have the same structure. I conducted all the oral interviews, and the deaf researcher conducted all the ESL interviews. We followed the same structure so that when I analyzed the data, we basically could compare the results from the oral interviews, the results of the oral interviews and the ones from the ESL interviews. We are very careful that we had consistency in the way we conducted the interview and we generated the same data. And I have to say that a few young people, about maybe 2 in the whole study, did not want to meet us. So they wanted to fill in the questions by email. But obviously, when you carry out an interview by email, it doesn't, I did send the questions and they filled in the document and they sent it back to me. The amount of information that we got was not as much as we would have liked to. So what I did in that case, I followed up with the emails afterwards to ask for more information, so that again we have consistency in the amount of data that we got from everyone.
Can I ask you, throughout your study, did you encounter any people who had used the services of a support employment organisation, so for example, to support them with liaising with employers, negotiating reasonable adjustments? The reason I'm asking is because I believe that certainly in Edinburgh and Lothians, there are support employment organisations that exist. However, there's very little provision for people who are deaf or hard of hearing within those organisations.
Thank you. That's a very good question as well, and this is something that we found. Some of the people that we interviewed did use the job centres, the disability, so what are they called, disability employment advisors in the job centres. And there were quite a few comments about the fact that they did not think that the support offered by the disability employment advisors in the job centres was in any way helpful. They believe that disability employment advisors were there to fill in reports rather than help them with jobs. However, some of the people that we interviewed were in touch with charities, third sector organizations, which had had employment advisors, and they did receive support from them, filling in applications, looking for jobs, making phone calls, this kind of support. But I would say that although the support was valued, what counted the most in terms of outcomes was the support of the family. They could not make up for the support of the family that other people received from their own family. Because in some cases, it would be the parents who would actively seek out these services and employ enlist their support. Parents would also help their children focus their career plans, fill in applications, advise them on, parents would advise them on the kind of university they should go to, on the kind of jobs they would apply to. So when that support didn't exist, disability employment specialist advisors helped, but not as much.
I'd just like to make some comments really about the implications for school services, because my job is to train teachers of deaf children. And I think that one of the most powerful findings from research was that children from poorer backgrounds had severely restricted opportunities, as we know they do in the UK in general. But for teachers of deaf children, focusing more on transition plans and focusing more on work experience placements, multiple work experience placements, would seem to be like a priority, I would say. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Maybe give me more ideas.
Yeah, sure. What we found was that when people left school, some of them did benefit from the help of career advisors in schools. And the ones who benefited the most were the young people who went on apprenticeships. Because career advisors so these were people with low qualifications who took an apprenticeship route at the recommendation of their careers advisors in schools. And deaf teachers for the deaf as well would often contribute, although it was, from my impression was that this was not necessarily part of their duties. Am I right? It's not something that they normally do, although they would often give informal advice to their students about what to expect after they leave school. Going back to apprenticeships, they seem to be a very good option for people with lower qualifications to increase their employability. Many of the young people that with low qualifications that we interview would have liked to get a modern apprenticeship or a placement training program, which would help them find a job later on. However, unfortunately, there would seem to be very little support, communication support in particular, on training programs. And one of the young men that we interviewed, this case comes to mind. He was in the second year on a modern apprenticeship, and his apprenticeship consisted of work on the construction site combined with courses at college. When he went to college, he did not have any support at all. He did not have a note taker, therefore he believed that he benefited very little from the lessons that he received this impacted on his learning at college. On the construction site, he obviously had no support as well, but he seemed to manage with the help of his co-workers. I guess that sounds very interesting.
I'm interested in the reference to the disability employment advisors in the EAs. If I remember rightly, they were introduced in the early 2000s. And we did a piece of work at the University of Central Lancs at that time with kind of mystery shoppers, deaf people going to the DEAs and looking for advice, and they said it was absolutely magic. So here we are, kind of 10 years later, and they're 200 miles away and the same old problem. It's not good news, is it? But the question I wanted to ask was, given what you said, I take the point very seriously about the role of parents in all of this. Where there were deaf children who did not share first language of their parents, that make any difference?
Right. We had very few of those kind of young people in our study. What happened is that, so we have only 5 PSL users, and out of the 5 PSL users that we interviewed, 3 of them had parents who had learned at least some basic form of PSL. So although they did not share the language, those parents who came from socioeconomic backgrounds made the effort to learn the language and to be able to support these children in the early years. What happened afterwards? To be honest, I don't know. We didn't look at that very much. So with PSL users, we did not get such a strong feeling that parents were involved in helping them get to work later on. Why, I do not know. However, parents were actively involved in making sure that the children got the best education they could. So these are the young people that I mentioned before who went down south to England for secondary schooling because their parents somehow believed that they would be better educated there. For those who did not do that, it was interesting because the 2 young people, it was only 2 young people who were BSL users. Sorry, we work with small numbers here when you break it down on characteristics. So we had 2 young people who were BSL users who came from socially disadvantaged areas, and they did not do that well on the labour market. They did struggle. I would not say that I can draw any strong conclusions based on 2 people. I think there is a lot of research that can be done on this topic, and this is something that hopefully you or me or somebody else will do in the future. The role of parents in helping young people find work when they don't share a common language is a very good topic.
Thank you for that. I found that a very interesting research topic, and I can't help think about my own situation because I'm thinking, I've been looking for a job for some time. I've got a degree and an MA, and when you talk about discrimination, I can't help but think about myself. So when you spoke to the young people about the kind of discrimination that they've experienced, I feel like sometimes I apply for a job and I'm overqualified. And I still feel like it's difficult for me, and I wonder if any of the young people you spoke to say they were overqualified for the jobs that they were applying for. And also, again, thinking about myself as a deaf person, I feel like I have limited choice about where I can apply for work. Often when I'm looking at what's available, let's say if I want to work in the deaf sector, I think looking further afield in the hearing sector might be too difficult for me, or I feel I don't want to be in an environment where I'm isolated because I can't communicate with everybody else in my workplace. So that kind of impacts on where I look for work. Did you find anything like that in your research?
Okay, so if I got this right, you want to know about whether people felt that they were overqualified for the jobs they were applying for, and whether they felt their options were limited when they were looking for work. Okay. Overqualification, that's a very interesting point, and I'm very grateful that you brought it up, because I've been doing some literature review recently on the employment experience of people who have disabilities of any kind, not only deafness. And what we did find is that there is a lot of evidence out there to say that people who have disabilities of any kind tend to be overqualified for the jobs that they're working. It's a very common thing, and it's not only true of Scotland or the UK, it's true internationally. This is an issue that seems to be quite common out there. I wouldn't say that the people in our study were overqualified for the jobs they applied for. Simply, one of the main reasons for this is simply they were very young. You have to remember that people we interviewed were between 18 and 24 of age. So they didn't really have, many of them didn't have the job, the time to become overqualified, you know what I mean. But what we did find, and it was very good news, was that when we looked at the kind of occupations Sorry. When we looked at the kind of occupations that deaf university graduates took up after they left university, we found actually something very positive. We found that they were more likely than their non-disabled peers to be in jobs which were graduate level jobs. And by that I mean managerial positions, maybe not as much, but in professional and associate professional occupations. And this happened to a larger degree. I mean, they had higher rates of employment in this kind of positions compared to people with no disabilities. And what this says, once more, is that when people with disabilities and people who are deaf, actually people who are deaf in particular have very good occupation profiles. When people who are deaf manage to go to university and obtain a degree, their employment prospects are quite good. Although you might say that you may be overqualified for the jobs that you do, or you have limited opportunities, they do have, on the whole, if you look at the data, the statistics, they have very good outcomes. You were also talking about the fact that you felt that you were limited in your options, in your employment options. Well, that is also possible. It was interesting because this issue of limited options came up when people were getting ready to go to university, and also when they were looking for jobs. And yes, indeed, when they were looking at subjects to study at university, many of them said that they felt that they didn't have that many options. Some of them would turn down degrees in business, for instance, because they thought they wouldn't be able to do the group work, for instance, that is required, or teamwork that is required in business. Other people would say that they don't feel comfortable being teachers. But these were only personal perceptions, because again, if you look at the data over the board, this is not necessarily true. There are other people who do very well deaf and do very well in business occupation, in business, and who have this kind of occupations, and people who are deaf and are very good teachers. So it really depends. I guess it's a matter of perceptions. It would be very interesting to have a survey which looks at the deaf population in Scotland and looks at the kind of occupations they have, and whether they think that they're overqualified for that, and whether they think that when they look for jobs, they feel that their options were limited. So thank you very much for that. It's a very good suggestion for future research.
I believe there was one more question.
I recently worked with a girl who's 9 years old using DSL, and she started to become quite reluctant to accept the communication in DSL, and especially when there were strangers in the room and visitors in the room that she just wanted to kind of hide. But previously, from a younger age, she was quite happy and quite open about using our communication through BSL. And I wonder if that's something that you took into consideration when you did your research, how people had felt maybe at different stages of their lives and the changes that maybe will happen naturally. Because I feel that children, as they grow up, become, a lot of people become quite self-conscious about themselves anyway, day.
And you want to know whether this had an impact on
the research? Was it possibly at the time that you interviewed them, or was it just basically at that one time you interviewed them?
Okay, thank you. What we found, the young people we interviewed were 18 to 24. I guess that at that age, their preference on whether they use, they prefer to communicate orally or DSL was pretty much set. Although I have to say, some of the young people who grew up with very little contact with deaf community or very little use of DSL, once they reached adulthood, tried to approach deaf young people who used to communicate with DSL. So that was quite interesting. So yes, I guess you have a point that there is some fluctuation in what people prefer to do. However, when it comes to their preferred mode of communication, I guess by the age of 18, they do set. They do tend to prefer one language or another. I don't know, I don't really specialize in that, so I can't really comment on this. However, you said you made a very interesting point, the fact that the little girl that you mentioned stopped being comfortable using DSL in the presence of others. Well, I guess it depends very much on who the hours were. It depends on the context. We also, I remember one case that comes to mind is that of a young girl who is a BSL user who went to a mainstream school. I think at the mainstream school she managed to communicate orally, so she was pretty much bilingual. She was very comfortable at that school and she had lots of friends up to the age of 7 or 8. I guess it's about the same age. That's what she said. And after that she started to feel socially isolated. I don't know, I can't comment on the business with that, but yes, that's a very interesting point. Yes, it's something that we might want to take into consideration in the future.
Just to say that equally she felt uncomfortable using a BSL in front of where people previously that she felt comfortable. So the environment hadn't changed, her situation hadn't changed.
Were they BSL users?
No.
No. Yes, I guess that's what I meant.
I think we should probably come to a close unless there are some very urgent questions. I think we've had quite a lot of questions anyway. Thank you very much for answering, Mariela. Thank you very much to Rob and Jemina for interpreting after a long day already with their volunteering here as interpreters. So thank you very much. Thanks also to Barry and Stacey for dealing with technology, live streaming, etc., Rachel and Ella for publicizing, etc. But once again, Mariela, thank you for a very interesting talk, very interesting talk. Thank you.
We've got some evaluation for this.
Oh yes, and could we also quickly do this shot of the audience
We would like our
looking interested and excited?